Chapter number 1. What is psycholinguistics? Psycholinguistics can be defined as the study of the mental representations and processes involved in language use. Who does psycholinguistics? Computer scientists, philosophers, teachers, and neuropsychologists. Those people are who does psycholinguistics. And some of the techniques used by psycholinguistics include observation and experiments that allow to measure brain activities during language tasks. Chapter 2. Planning utterance. This very much is the process of planning before producing language. Some important factors are involved, such as pausing, hesitation, stressing, intonation, in order to make sense to the production of language. It is a process of planning before producing. We first conceptualize, then we plan, and also as part of this we make pauses. Chapter 3. Finding words. It is about choosing or finding words in our lexicon, which is a mental dictionary in human's head. So it will be regarding to how a word needs to be retrieved from the lexicon to be used in a conversation, but also it is related to the very common speech errors. And it involves the process of first having the concept, then the lemma, which is the picture in our brain, and finally the lexeme, which is finally the production of the concept you first had. The various aspects of constructing and utterance interact with one another and do not represent entirely distinct stages of the language production process.
According to the chapter 4, it practically and mainly talks about how words are built. The title says it, building words. It is once they are structured, how a person reads them and writes them, how a person speaks them, how they come out from the tongue, from the mouth. Also, it says here in the chapter that world building includes morphological structures and phonological structures. That are the structures that are based for a person to come out with the words. It is also based on the regularity on the sounds, on the errors a person can make once they are speaking it. It says in the chapter that it comes out from the tip of the tongue. Like basically once a person is realizing a tongue twister, it also has to do with the errors it has right there. Also, well, that practically something obviously that words are built phrase by phrase. Those are the things that are like the characteristics that a building words have. Also, it includes like as word frames the stress of the information, also of the sounds of each word or letter, the stress a person puts in it. And we'll also we were talking about the stress also in the structure of the syllables. Also, the information about it also in this chapter talks about the information on phonological and phonetic structure. Basically, this chapter has to do with um the structures, the characteristic of a word is built, and it also leads us for a next chapter to the chapter 5. The next chapter, that is number 5, the title is monitoring and repair. It says right here, speakers monitor their own speech for a number of types of well-formedness. According to the title and to all the information in general given, monitoring and repair is basically based on what when a person is speaking, when they're realizing a sentence or a word, they're having a speech, a talk with another person, and that's the speaker thing, and the listener has to practically repair the errors one maybe, and sometimes one us as speakers that we don't give we don't have the necessary vocabulary or pronunciation, the fluency that a listener needs to understand us. So this practically is on understanding and getting realized about the errors we have as speakers, and the listeners have to repair and talk about the errors. Also, this works as two persons or just one. As understanding your own errors, your critical own thinking. It says here about self-monitoring, that speakers want to repair errors in their output as a feedback that listeners give when they have not understood on what they're saying. It also talks about here like the repair the errors of the speaker by the interruption. Also says here that speaking helping listeners. This is a phrase that has to do with like we were saying, the necessities of a listener. This has to do when a speaker has fluency or tries to develop a better language, so the listener doesn't have more trouble, doesn't struggle on understanding them. Also, in this chapter has practically some detailed things, the use of the speech errors in providing evidence about the speech process, the monitoring of the speech, and also the monitoring of output in general. Like I said, this is practically the errors a person has once they're talking in the language and the words, and the repairing thing, the interruption of listeners to mainly to know and get along with the errors you're having, to have a better language.
In the chapter number 6, we see the use of gestures. In this chapter, we consider the importance of gesture when talking with another person or speaking a speech. The gestures have two types of function. The first one is the contribution in the content of what the speaker is saying, and the second one is to help manage the conversation. There are many kinds of gestures that help to express the speakers and to understand the listeners. The gestures help the speakers and the listeners to maintain and understand and better conversation with the help of the gestures. The conversation becomes to give and to catch the message better. In the chapter number 7, Perception for Language, this chapter shows us two very important aspects in the perception, the visual and the auditive. This chapter focuses on the perception of language processing and also on a linguistic system to interpret signals. The basic task for the language comprehension, the user needs to recognize the image and signals that reach the brain. When the signal reaches the brain, they go through a process of identification, recognize the signal, and then interpret the meaning of the signal. This is the perception of language.
Chapter number 8, Recognizing Spoken Words. The purpose of this chapter is to present some of what we know about how people recognize words. The focus of this chapter will be on the recognition of the spoken words. As you remember, the minimal unit of meaning is the morpheme, which can include, for instance, endings that cannot be used on their own, but which can combine meanings such as plural or past. Also, it's important to mention that words building block of language, and word recognition needs to be efficient and reliable, since it gives access to meanings and grammatical information required for comprehension. The word recognition process has a number of stages: lexical, mapping, and consequent activation of candidate words. Chapter number 9, Visual Word Recognition. Visual perception of language involves a series of processing levels, including an input buffer for the visual stimulus, the transfer of information from there to working memory, and the linguistic interpretation of the analyzed input. Here we have the dyslexia. This is affecting reading processes and is therefore different from, but will often coexist with dysgraphia, which affects writing processes. Dyslexia can be acquired or development. In developmental dyslexia, there is no obvious single event, such as head trauma, that has resulted in the problem faced by dyslexic, and it is usually the case that the full range of normal reading skills has never been present. Acquired dyslexia, on the other hand, is usually the result of brain damage, resulting from a blow to the head. In this chapter, we've seen that the visual word recognition in reading involves a range of skills: individual letter recognition, whole word recognition, and the mapping between letters and pronunciation. Chapter number 10: Syntactic Sentence Processing. In the psycholinguistic